Cold cases are a fascinating subject. When following one of these cases, we not only get to speculate about the circumstances of a crime and the person who may have committed it, but we also get insight into the methods used by investigators while they were trying to solve a crime decades ago. It's even more satisfying when one of these cases is eventually solved thanks to new evidence that's found, or the advancement of investigative techniques, and when this happens, the families of those affected by the crime can finally find a sense of closure, even if it's a very long time after the fact. Number 5. The case involving the disappearance of 27-year-old Linda Sobek, a former cheerleader with the Los Angeles Raiders NFL team, immediately garnered a lot of media attention, since she was well known among the team's fans, and at one point, investigators were receiving as many as 100 calls every hour from members of the public who thought they had information that may help solve the case. On the 16th of November, 1995, the day that Linda mysteriously disappeared, Linda was living in a small cottage in California, and she made a phone call to her mother, Elaine, early in the morning to tell her that she would be attending a modeling photo shoot and an audition for a television show later that day. She explained to her mother that she would call again later in the day to discuss plans the family had to have a barbecue on the coming weekend. But when she never made the call as promised, her mother started to become concerned that something untoward had happened, and she filed a missing person report with the police. The first thing investigators did was speak to her roommates in Hermosa Beach in case they knew what her plans were and who she may have been with that day, but they stated that she always pinned her schedule in a day planner and that she had this with her when she disappeared. They then looked into past relationships that Linda had, in case one of her ex-partners had something to do with her disappearance. But this also led to a dead end, as they were eliminated as suspects one after another. Elaine also didn't know who the photographer was who was supposed to conduct the photo shoot, since Linda was in a rush when they spoke on the phone and failed to mention any specific details. Linda's family and friends started printing flyers containing her photo and put them up in hopes that someone may have seen or heard something on the day that she vanished. She also contacted members of the media to bring more attention to Linda's case, hoping that her time with the Los Angeles Raiders would jog people's memories. Then, on the 21st of November, investigators finally got their lead in the case. They received a call from a man who stated that he had found some of Linda's photos while he was helping the local community clean up Angeles National Forest. He noticed the photos in a trash can and found Linda so attractive that he decided to keep a few for himself. A few days later, he saw reports on the news that the woman in the photos was missing, and he immediately contacted the police to report what he had found. He also managed to lead investigators to the exact spot where he found the photos, and here they managed to find even more evidence. The trash that had been collected in the forest by volunteers was still being kept in dumpsters before being hauled away, and inside, officers found more of Linda's photos, as well as her missing day planner. They could finally learn who the photographer was that Linda was supposed to work with on the day that she vanished. But these hopes were quickly dashed when it was found that that day's specific page, the 16th of November, had been ripped out of the planner, and it now became all but certain that Linda was a victim of foul play. All of the trash contained in the dumpsters was taken into evidence and moved back to the police department so that it could be searched for any further evidence. There was also a good chance that Linda was still in the forest somewhere, and so a search of the area was quickly organized and aided by canine search units. This is when their efforts finally paid off. Among the trash that had been collected from the forest was a receipt from the Lexus Corporation. Someone had rented a Lexus SUV on the day that Linda disappeared, and luckily it contained that person's name, Charles Rathbun, who also happened to be a photographer. They then contacted the Lexus Corporation and were told that the vehicle had been brought back 4 days later on the 20th of November. The SUV was immediately seized as evidence and searched with a fine-toothed comb. Rathbun had asked to come into the police station to make a formal statement after he made a very strange statement, telling investigators that they probably wanted to question him because he was the last person to see Linda alive. What struck investigators as strange was the fact that they'd never made any mention of the last person to see Linda, and Rathbun's statement instantly caused them to become suspicious. He added that he had met with Linda at a Denny's restaurant since they had worked together 2 years earlier, and he needed a model for Alexa's photo shoot. But he found that Linda wouldn't be the right fit for the shoot, and they parted ways after the meeting. He claimed to have seen Linda drive off in her car, but this was also refuted when Linda's car was found in the Denny's parking lot, where she had parked it before the meeting. Investigators waited for Rathbone to make his formal statement, but he never showed up at the police station. This caused even more suspicion, and so he was placed under surveillance, and it soon came to light that he'd been telling some of his acquaintances that he was the one who made Linda disappear. Rathbone was eventually arrested after he discharged a firearm and injured one of his friends, and when he was questioned again, his story changed. He now claimed that he and Linda had traveled 40 miles to the Mojave Desert in his rented Lexus, where they took some photos at the El Mirage dry lake bed. He claimed that he wanted to take a few photos of the Lexus in action and asked Linda to do a few donuts on the lake bed, but she was unable to control the car properly and he decided to take over. Then came a shocking revelation. He says that while he was trying to teach Linda how to do donuts, he accidentally hit her with the car, instantly ending her life. For a few moments, he thought about taking her to a hospital, but he claimed to have panicked and decided to bury her in the desert instead. The problem with this version of events was that when the Lexus was searched, they found no damage and no indication that he had hit Linda with the car. To make matters worse, when his house was searched, investigators found over 100 firearms, duct tape, and lengths of cord. Sensing that he was fooling no one, Rathbone finally relented and led investigators to the site where he had buried Linda, not in the desert, but back at the Angeles National Forest where they had actually met. It was quickly determined that she had not been struck with a car, and thanks to marks on her body, it was clear that she'd been tied up at some point. It was eventually determined that Rathbone had asphyxiated his victim, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. Number 4. On the 13th of November, 2016, 44-year-old Stephen Allwine from Cottage Grove, Minnesota, made a 911 call that would strike not only the dispatcher but also investigators as strange, since he seemed inordinately calm despite the fact that he believed his wife Amy was deceased. To the members of their church, Stephen and Amy's relationship seemed nearly idyllic, since they had a strong religious belief and seemed to be raising their adoptive son to hold the same beliefs they did. Stephen, who served as a deacon in their church, worked as an IT specialist while Amy ran her own dog training business. But their lives would take a most unexpected turn when they were contacted by the FBI and a detective who had some unsettling news to share. They informed the couple that they'd received an inordinate amount of emails from an anonymous tipster who had visited a site called Besa Mafia on the darknet and found Amy's name among those people who had contracts taken out on their lives. The Besa Mafia site claimed to have access to contract killers from Albania, and for a fee, anyone with a Tor browser and enough money could select a name and have that person's life ended. Investigators were unable to track the source of the emails, since several relay servers from all over the world were being used. What they did know was that the user called themselves Dog Day God, and that they intended to pay for the $12,000 transaction using Bitcoin. The rest of the emails contained conversations about how payment would be made, and why this person wanted to have Amy killed. They claimed that Amy was having an affair with their husband, which led to their marriage coming off the rails. They also added that Amy had stolen some of their clients, and that their business was suffering as a result. The couple was shocked at hearing the news, and they speculated that the person had the wrong Amy in mind, but this simply wasn't the case. 9 months later, Stephen would make the strange 911 call claiming that he had found Amy unresponsive in their bedroom with biological material all around her. In the call, he speculated that she had used a firearm to end her own life. When investigators arrived at the scene, Stephen told them that Amy had been feeling ill that morning, and to give her a break, he took their son to his father-in-law at around noon. He added that he then picked the boy up at around 5 p.m., after which the two went out for dinner at a Culver's restaurant. Once they were done there, they returned to the house, and this is when Stephen made the gruesome discovery. When the scene was processed, investigators became suspicious, since it didn't look like the typical crime scene where someone had attempted to take their own life. Amy was known to be right-handed, and yet she was holding Stephen's firearm in her left hand instead. It was also very unlikely that she had pulled the trigger, since there weren't any powder burns on either her hands or her head, which would be the case if the firearm was discharged at a close distance. When luminol was used to check for biological material, it seemed to indicate that some parts of the house had been cleaned, and furthermore, all of the evidence seemed to indicate that Amy's body had been moved from elsewhere in the house. When an autopsy was performed, scopolamine was found in Amy's system, and investigators noted that this anti-nausea medication can cause some people to become overly compliant and easy to manipulate when too high of a dosage is taken. Then there was the fact that someone had taken out a contract on Amy's life. But if this was indeed the work of a professional hitman, they would typically use their own firearm rather than one that had been located inside the victim's house. The decision was made to look at Stephen's electronic devices, and on them, forensic experts found damning evidence against him. On his computer, they found a 34-digit Bitcoin address that matched an address found on the Besa Mafia site. Just as damning was the fact that the user Dog Day God had tried to purchase scopolamine from Dream Market, another darknet site. It had become rather obvious that Stephen was the one who intended to take Amy's life, and that he was trying to make it look as though she had taken her own life. Stephen was arrested and charged with ending Amy's life. At his trial, prosecutors claimed that he was having one or more affairs, and since it would be frowned upon by the church for the couple to get divorced, he felt his only option to get out of the marriage was to have Amy's life ended by a hitman, and failing that, he decided to do it himself. The defense, though, argued that Stephen couldn't possibly have moved Amy's body, since he weighed around 240 pounds, and added that some of the couple's neighbors reported hearing vehicles speeding past their house on the day that the crime was committed, suggesting that someone else was responsible for the crime. But prosecutors added that Amy had a $700,000 life insurance policy to her name, and argued that this was yet another reason why Stephen wanted to end her life, since he would have had an easy and very large payday. Stephen's trial lasted for 6 days, and it took the jury 8 hours to reach a guilty verdict, though he continued to claim that he had nothing to do with the crime. This did nothing to affect his sentence, though, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Once the Besa Mafia site was shut down, it was found to have all been a scam where people would pay for a hitman to carry out a job, only to find that no such person exists, and they would find themselves out of a lot of money that they would never recover. Number 3. It isn't often that a missing person investigation leads authorities to even more missing people, but in the case of 79-year-old Felix Vil, this is exactly what happened, and his crimes have now been finally exposed for all to see. It started on the 28th of October in 1962, when Vil and his wife, Mary Horton Vil, were spending time on the river in Louisiana aboard Felix's boat. But later that night, Vil would ask for help from people a few miles down the river when Mary fell overboard. When investigators arrived at the scene, he told them that he and Mary had been making their way down the river when she yelled that she saw a stump in the water. He stated that he had no choice but to swerve to avoid a collision, and when he did so, Mary lost her balance and fell overboard. He added that he made every effort to save her from the water, but was unable to do so. He then traveled further down the river to call for help, but Vil's version of events just didn't sit right with investigators. When Mary's family was informed of what had happened, they told investigators that she believed she was pregnant with the couple's second child. It took 2 days of searching before Mary was eventually found, and her body was extracted from the water. When an autopsy was performed, the coroner ruled that Mary's passing was the result of a tragic accident, but not everyone was convinced, and when it came to light that Vil had taken 2 substantial life insurance policies out on Mary's life, investigators grew even more suspicious. The decision was made to arrest Vil, and he was charged with ending Mary's life. But for reasons unknown, the district attorney decided to drop all charges against him without making a request for an indictment. But this wouldn't be the last time that Vil was suspected of being responsible for someone's demise. 3 decades after Mary lost her life, her brother Will received a call from someone who stated that Vil had married their daughter, who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. They added that Vil had a girlfriend before marrying their daughter, and that woman had also disappeared under suspicious circumstances. It's then that the state of Vale's relationships after Mary would come to light. Vale met a 15-year-old girl named Annette Craver in 1982 at a garage sale in Houston, and quite unbelievably, her mother gave consent for the two to get married 2 years later after she graduated from high school, a decision that she now regrets. But the very next year, Annette would go missing while the couple was traveling through the Midwest, and when Vale was questioned by investigators, he stated that while they were camping in St. Louis, Annette decided that she no longer wanted to be in a relationship with him. He added that he didn't want to stand in her way, and so he put her on a bus to Mexico as she requested, and he never saw her again. Her mother, Rose, stated that she desperately wanted to believe his version of events, but something just didn't feel right about his story. Rose never heard from Annette again, and for 2 decades she searched for answers, but no one seemed interested in taking up the case. But in 2010, she spoke to Jerry Mitchell, a reporter with the Clarion Ledger, who was already looking into Mary's passing on the river. During his investigation, he made some surprising and startling discoveries. When he attempted to study the police records about the incident, he found that most of them were missing, but he soon found a vital piece of evidence. It would come to light that someone who was present when Mary was brought out of the water had taken 2 photos of her body. These were taken to forensic experts, who then found that there were inconsistencies between the coroner's report and what could be seen in the photos. They noted that Mary's body was found in a strange position, and that her clothes had oil stains on them. Even more disconcerting was the fact that Mary had bruising on the back of her head, and when she was found, it was noted that she had a scarf pushed about 6 inches into her mouth. Even back in 1962, when Mary was found, some investigators thought that Vale had ended her life by hitting her in the back of the head with one of the boat's oars, but they found no evidence to back this theory up. 2 years after starting his investigation, Mitchell made contact with a man named Wesley Turnage, who was a former neighbor of Vale's. He told Mitchell that Vale had confessed to him that he had intentionally ended his wife's life. Mitchell convinced Turnage to go to the police, and once there, he stated that Vale had told him that Mary wanted another child, believing this would bring an end to their marital problems. But Vale felt otherwise and wasn't interested in having another baby, telling Turnage that he didn't even want the child that he did have, and certainly wasn't about to have another one, and he made sure that Mary wouldn't ever have another child either. Another man named Robert Fremont also came forward to state that Vale had confessed to killing Mary. He added that he had confided in him on 2 separate occasions, suggesting that he had ended her life with one of the boat's oars. But the story would get even more involved when Rose revealed that Vale was also considered the last person to see Sharon Hensley, another missing woman, right before she disappeared. Vale and Hensley were a couple in the latter part of the 60s, and they traveled along the California coast together, with Vale and Mary's son, Billy. At one point in the trip, Billy walked into a police station to report that Vale had been giving him illegal substances and that he wanted it to stop. He also stated that he heard Vale tell Sharon that he had intentionally ended Mary's life. Investigators questioned Vale about Billy's claims, but he refused to speak to them, and no charges were brought against him. He would later claim that Sharon had met a couple while they were traveling and decided that she would rather join them on their trip instead. Neither Sharon nor Annette have ever been found, and their cases remain unsolved, despite the overwhelming belief that Vale was responsible for their disappearance. As for the case against him and Mary's passing, Vale was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He continues to maintain his innocence, even going as far as to claim that he knows where both missing women are, but that he refuses to reveal their locations since they're in a Felix Vil witness protection program. Number 2. On the 19th of December, 1985, 83-year-old Minnie Morin was supposed to host a Christmas lunch for ladies from her church's congregation at her and her 81-year-old husband, Ed's house in Ethel, Washington, where they ran a Christmas tree business. But when the women started arriving at the house, they were surprised to find that no one was home. They decided to wait around since the couple may have been out, but when they still hadn't returned by that afternoon, the group decided to contact the couple's family members, but they hadn't seen any sign of them either. As the afternoon turned into evening, the decision was made to contact the police, who arrived at the 120-acre farm at around 6 p.m. They made their way into the couple's house and found that everything wasn't as it should be. First, Minnie's wallet was recovered from behind a couch, and it had been covered with pages from a newspaper. Secondly, Ed's watch was found on his bedside stand, which was strange since he never went anywhere without it. They also found pages from a bank statement in the couple's bathroom. It was also noted that their car, a green 1968 Chrysler, wasn't parked in the garage as expected, and a search of the area was quickly organized. Deputies drove around looking for signs of the couple, but to no avail as they couldn't be located. A description of the Chrysler was made available, and soon someone reported seeing it parked in the Yardbird parking lot the day after they went missing. When investigators reached the scene, they were able to confirm that it was indeed the Marins' car, and when it was searched, they made a worrying discovery. There was no sign of either Minnie or Ed, but the car contained a lot of biological material as well as a blanket, which, when lifted up, was found to be concealing even more biological material. Furthermore, they found a single white shoe, a man's hat, and several pieces of ammunition. There was also a crack in the Chrysler's windshield. The car was dusted for prints, but none were found, and investigators strongly suspected that Minnie and Ed were no longer alive after meeting with foul play. It was decided to follow up on the bank statements that were found, and when investigators contacted Ed's bank, they were told that he had phoned the bank to organize for a withdrawal of $8,500, which he said was to help a family member buy a car. Ed's family members were questioned, but they stated that they had no information about anyone in the family needing a car, or of anyone who had asked Ed for financial aid of any kind. This led investigators to believe that Ed was forced by someone to withdraw the money, and that he had made up the story about buying a car to avoid suspicion, since Minnie's life was likely in danger. On the 24th of December, a member of the public contacted police to state that they had stumbled upon a mannequin lying in a ditch by the side of the road, but when they got closer, they were horrified to discover that it was actually the body of an elderly woman who turned out to be Minnie. While investigating the scene, officers also found spent ammunition, biological material, a set of false teeth, and a comb. Not long after, they found Ed's remains and their worst fears had been realized. Ed and Minnie had been murdered with a firearm. Investigators put out an appeal to anyone who saw the couple before their disappearance to come forward, and to their surprise, several people stated that they saw Ed and Minnie's car in the area along with an unidentified man who was sitting in the back seat. Some of the witnesses also reported seeing a man leaving the car while holding a long item, believed to be a firearm wrapped in a towel. They were able to give a description of the man, and a composite sketch was created, but this did nothing to further the investigation. The case went cold, and for the next 7 years, no further leads were found until a woman named Robin Rife came forward to report that she had dropped her ex-husband, Rick Rife, and his brother, John, off just a short distance from the couple's home before their lives were ended. She added that John phoned her the next day and told her to pick him and Rick up. When she arrived at the agreed-upon location, she saw a body, but was unable to see who it was before they left the scene. Unfortunately, Robin was serving jail time at the time, and so her claims weren't followed up on, since she didn't have the best reputation. The case would go cold again until 2009, when a new detective was put on the case. He decided to revisit some photos that were taken at the time, and he had colorized them, resulting in several witnesses identifying Rick and John Rife. It was now all but certain that the two brothers were responsible for Ed and Minnie's passing, and the decision was made to have them arrested. But John had already passed away by this point, and Rick vehemently denied any involvement in the crime. It seemed as though the brothers would get away with what they had done, until another witness suddenly came forward to state that he had seen the couple before their lives were ended. James Shriver, a family friend of the Marins, told investigators that his mother was driving him to the dentist when he saw the Marins' car, but he found it strange that Minnie was sitting in the back seat with John Rife, while Ed was in the driver's seat with Rick Rife next to him. He added that as he and his mother drove past the car, he waved to the couple, but no one in the car waved back, which he also found strange, since they knew each other very well. He would later express his regret at not coming forward with this information years earlier, stating that it felt as if he'd betrayed the Marins by keeping quiet. But thanks to Shriver, Investigators now have enough evidence to arrest the remaining Rife brother, and he was charged with robbery in the first degree, burglary in the first degree, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. In 2013, 28 years after the Marins had their lives ended, Rick Rife was finally put on trial, though he still claimed to know nothing about their passing. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to no less than 103 years behind bars, ensuring that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison for his heinous crime. Number 1. In 1986, Teresa Lee Scaff, a 29-year-old woman from Lakeland, Florida, was working as a trauma nurse at what was then known as Lakeland General Hospital. And on the 27th of October of that year, she was planning on having an early night since she had to be at work again early the following morning. At the time, Teresa was a single mother to a young boy and she lived in a duplex. But that evening, her son wasn't home as he was visiting his grandmother. Teresa's family describes her as being a very loving person who was close with her family and friends. She was a sensitive soul who didn't like administering injections to small babies, and she was often seen crying when young people were brought into the hospital after being involved in tragic accidents. The next day, her mother, Betty, received a worrying phone call from the hospital, asking if she had seen her since she'd failed to show up for her shift, which was completely out of character for her. Betty knew something was wrong, and she traveled to Teresa's house at around 8:30 p.m., but found that the door was locked. She used one of her credit cards to open the door, and once she made it inside, her heart dropped when she found Teresa deceased. Despite being panicked about what she had found, Betty remembered that Teresa kept the police's number written next to the house's phone in case her son needed it, and she managed to report the grim discovery that she had made. When investigators processed the crime scene, they found that Teresa's life had been ended with a sharpened blade, and they noticed that she fought back valiantly since there were defensive marks on her hands. Betty also noted that it had been raining that day, and speculated that a lot of evidence that may have been left behind by Teresa's attacker had been washed away. Investigators were able to collect samples of biological material that didn't belong to Teresa from the scene, and they were sent to a crime lab to be processed. There was no DNA technology to track the culprit at the time, though, and the sample led nowhere. It would be entered into the CODIS database in the 2000s, but there was no match in the system, and Teresa's attacker still remained unidentified. There were no further leads to follow up on, and so investigators' only option was to talk to people in the neighborhood in case one of them had seen something suspicious that night. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case, and no suspects were identified. It now became clear that Teresa's attacker didn't have a criminal record, since their DNA was nowhere to be found in the law enforcement database. Teresa's sister, Lynn, did, however, tell investigators that she'd been talking about a neighbor who she found rather creepy, since he exhibited stalker-like behavior, but she never disclosed the man's name, and so he couldn't be identified or brought in for questioning. Betty made it clear that she was unhappy about the way that the police went about their investigation, specifically pointing out that they only spent a short amount of time at Teresa's house, and she felt that they might have overlooked some vital pieces of evidence. She never gave up hope that Teresa's killer would be found, and in 2002, it started to look as though she might get her wish. The sample of biological material that was found at the scene of the crime was sent to Othram Inc., a company that specializes in aiding investigators with cold cases with the use of forensic genetic genealogy. This time, some progress was made when the lead detective in the case started building a family tree using the results from the DNA sample, and it started to look ever more likely that this creepy neighbor that Teresa described, a man named Donald Douglas, was responsible. Incredibly, Douglas was interviewed by investigators during the initial investigation, but he had no criminal record, and it was noted that he didn't have any marks or bruises on him, which made it unlikely that he was the culprit since there'd been a struggle during the attack, and it's usually the case that the attacker also sustains at least some injuries in this type of case. Douglas's son was identified and asked to provide a DNA sample so that the case could be brought to a close, and he complied. It was then found beyond a doubt that Douglas was responsible for ending Teresa's life. But with this victory came some bittersweet news. Douglas had passed away in 2008 when he was 55 years old, and he couldn't be held accountable for the horrific crime that he had committed. The case had finally been solved, and Teresa's family received at least some sense of closure. But it was disappointing to find out that justice would not be served after all. Douglas's son was said to be horrified when he found out that his father was the one who ended Teresa's life, but was glad that he was able to assist investigators in bringing the case to a close. All that was left now was to speculate about how Douglas had carried out the crime and what his motive was, since he had never been in any trouble with the law before and seemingly displayed no violent behavior. Investigators believe that Douglas noticed Teresa while he was her neighbor living in a property behind her house. They think that he became infatuated with her and at one point suggested that they start a relationship. But since Teresa had already described him to the family members as stalker-ish and creepy, she obviously didn't have any interest in him and rebuffed his advances. It's speculated that this made him very angry and possibly a little embarrassed, which motivated him to carry out the heinous crime. Betty believes that he planned his attack meticulously and that he had watched her in the days prior to the incident. She stated that Teresa would have never opened her front door to anyone she didn't trust, and hence it's unlikely that she would have done so for a man she found to be unnerving and who exhibited stalker-like tendencies. She believes that Douglas knew the layout of her house and that he had made his way into the duplex before she arrived home from work that night, possibly gaining entry into the building via the house's sliding doors that were situated at the back of the house. She thinks that when Teresa arrived home, he had the upper hand, since she would not have expected anyone to be lying in wait for her. And although she was able to fight back to some degree, he eventually overpowered her and ended her life with a sharpened blade. Lynn had also stated that she wishes Teresa had described the creepy neighbor to her when they spoke about it, since this would have gone a long way towards narrowing the pool of possible suspects in the area, and it may have led to Douglas being identified as the attacker. She's urged other women who may be experiencing the same kind of behavior from anyone to provide family members, friends, or the police with a description, since it could prove to be invaluable in the future. Of course, no one can say for certain whether Teresa's case would have been solved sooner had she given a description of Douglas, but it is something that most people who are aware of the case will always wonder about, and it's a piece of advice that may just stop a similar crime from being committed in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.